All right. Hello, everybody. And we are going to be jumping back into Christianity and critical realism. And I'm trying to remember exactly how I made this happen before. Let's see if I put this here and I go like that. No, I want it on the other side, I think. Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to get the camera properly oriented. Yes, that's good. And is my distance away appropriate as well? I think I ended up zooming in a little bit more on it last time. That made it easier for me. So we had started reading Christianity and Critical Realism. I've been reading this book for a while now, but I started reading it on stream, I don't know, a month or two ago or whatever. And you guys seemed to like it. And I was going to stop and just read some of the book just now by myself. And so I figured, why not read it on stream? Okay, that's basically what happened here. So when it went ahead and went live, Christianity and Critical Realism is, I think, a great introduction to the ideas of critical realism, especially for somebody who's not as familiar, right? So if you don't understand or know what critical realism is, but you're a Christian who's interested, then I believe this is a great starting point, right? And let's see. Oh, yeah, look at that. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading in chapter 11, and I've got my trusty pen here as well, so I'll be making highlights, adjustments, all that type of stuff as we go. But that's my goal, is to get through one chapter here, and we are in chapter 11, which is entitled Theological Science, right? And the way I've got this set up, yeah, that works pretty well, is I can read on screen just as you guys are seeing it there, right? So that's the idea. I might have to move these, just moving my chats so I can see if you guys are saying anything. And yeah, that should be good. All right. He says, for Christians, the Bible is the divinely inspired human product of the early church's attempts to make theological sense of divine action and human responses to divine action, culminating in the person and work of Jesus Christ. As such, it functions as a mediatory witness to historical events whose authority is not imposed from outside, but is intrinsic to the biblical texts themselves. Christians experience, understand, and judge these particular accounts of Jesus as more powerful, comprehensive, and truthful than any other account available to them. So that's really important, is it's appealed to the best explanation, okay? It is inference to the best explanation. That is abductive reasoning at its heart. And this is very different from what you often hear in Protestant contexts, right? So, and it's part of what I like so much about critical realism, right? So again, from the start, Christian theologians recognize the apprehension, no, just before that. It functions as a mediatory witness to historical events whose authority is not imposed from outside, but is intrinsic to the biblical texts themselves. Christians experience, understand, and judge these particular accounts of Jesus as more powerful, comprehensive, and truthful than any other account available to them. That's the idea, right? So let's grab that one here. Oh dear. I'll tell you, it's a little bit harder to highlight when I'm way back here. I can hardly read it. Well, it's a mess, but I highlighted it. From the start, Christian theologians recognized the apprehension of the alethic truth claims embodied within Scripture require a theological hermeneutic capable of penetrating beneath the surface of the biblical text and engaging with the ontological reality of God's actions in history to which the texts bear witness. As a result, the Christian tradition developed retroductive models of its understanding of God in the form of creedal statements, which it recognized as the most powerful, comprehensive, and alethically truthful explanatory accounts of the nature and actions of God currently available to it. At the same time, in recognizing its creeds as the fallible products of human endeavor, very, very important there. Its creeds are the fallible products of human endeavor, okay? For critical realism, all truth claims are potentially up for grabs. All of them are able to be questioned, right? We say these are the best explanations we have to date, but we can account for new information coming in and adjust our takes as needed, okay? It accepted the need to subject them to ongoing iterative refinement. See, that's the key. Ongoing iterative refinement, okay? And what has happened in church history is we have said certain things like, the Nicene Creed, for example, are not subject to ongoing iterative refinement. That is out of step with critical realism. Again, it's not to say we reject the Nicene Creed, but we say in principle that we potentially could come to a better conclusion, a better explanation, etc., either through more information being made available to us or having a better interpretation or understanding of same set information, right? The history of dogmatic or systematic theology is the history of ongoing attempts of Christian theologians working within the paradigmatic Trinitarian framework grounded in the Bible and articulated in the ecumenical creeds to deepen both its understanding of God and its understanding of the intellectual warrant for its theological assertions. In this chapter, we will explore one instance of this ongoing history. As previously noted, the work of the Scottish theologian Thomas Torrance constitutes the first major exploration of the interface between Christian doctrine and critical realism. T.F. Torrance, I've read a little bit of. He never struck me as a critical realist, but I wasn't open to these ideas back then. We will focus on his account of the epistemic basis and intellectual warrant of Christian truth claims rather than the material substance of his theology, concentrating especially on his magnum opus, Theological Science, delivered as lectures in 1959, though not published until 1969. In comparing and contrasting the respective epistemologies of theological science and the natural sciences, Torrance sought to underlabor for the Christian community by reaffirming the inherent intelligibility of its classical Trinitarian doctrines and thereby recalling to its proper object of worship. Okay, very good. So I'm already liking this chapter very much. So here, theological epistemology. Before I start reading, I'm going to take another sip of tea here. Delicious. All right, theological epistemology. Torrance's account of theological epistemology rejects both deductive and inductive reasoning. Well, I'm already liking that because I am a fan of abductive inference. You know what? We had to read T.F. Torrance in seminary, but again, he never came across as a critical realist to me, but I wasn't aware of those categories back then. I found him very theological, right? Deductive arguments, such as the ontological argument that God is by definition perfect, that is more perfect to exist than not to exist, and that therefore God must exist, collapse because of the coherence of linguistic statements alone does not guarantee their ontological purchase upon reality. I agree with that completely. Conceptual understanding must always give way to ontological reality. If we fail to allow this to happen, then we commit the epistemic fallacy of forcing reality into the Procrustean bed of our own a priori assumptions and prejudices. As Einstein recognized, Newton's commitment to Aristotelian logic in general and the notion of absolute time and space in particular had to be abandoned in order to make way for the theory of relativity and of relative time and space demanded by the deepening understanding of the ontology of nature. 2. Inductive arguments, such as the cosmological argument that the universe constitutes a network of causes, that the notion of the infinite regress of causes lacks explanatory power and that therefore there must be a first divine cause, collapse, not merely because of generalizations from regular occurring patterns of sense experience cannot predict irregularities, but, and more fundamentally, because surface descriptions of empirical reality cannot produce deep causal explanations as to why such patterns occur in the way that they do. Thus, for example, the fact that we have seen only white swans does not rule out the existence of black swans. The color of swans is best explained by reference to their DNA rather than observation of the regular appearance of swans of a particular color. I like this. And this is why inductive conclusions are tentative in nature and are not decidedly true. They're not required to be true, right? They're a probability metric, okay? Please say that we're going to get to abductive inference or retroduction as the answer. Torrance argues from the start we are unavoidably caught up in a web of knowledge relationships. Since we know only as human beings, there is a necessary personal coefficient to our knowledge of the world we indwell and in which we participate. Love it. This rules out both forms of objectivism that seek to bracket out the knowing subject and forms of subjectivism that seek to bracket out the object of knowledge. Because we participate in knowledge relationships prior to our reflective understanding of them, we always know more than we can actually tell. It follows that the necessary basis of all understanding is tacit belief grounded not in indubitable foundations, but in intuitive apprehension. Tacit intuitive faith is a transcendent reality independent of our knowledge of it and accessible to all men, is the common determinant of the scientific enterprise. Louder for the people in the back. Come on. I did not know Torrance would be such an ally for the critical realist. This is very exciting stuff. Where naturalists identify this transcendent reality with the natural order of things, theists identify it with God. In both cases, the realistic pursuit of truth is ultimately dependent on the tacit intuitive acknowledgement of a concept of reality as that which has the independence and power to reveal itself in an infinite range of unexpected manifestations. I got to read Torrance's Theological Science, I think. This is really cool. I wonder if I have it. Probably not the time to do this. On the other screen, I'm searching if in my Logos library I have Theological and Natural Science. Yeah, cool. He's going to be worth reading. The path from tacit intuitive knowledge to explicit reflective understanding follows the path from abductive through retroductive to iterative reasoning. Bing, ding, 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 ding. Abduction is fundamentally innovatory and creative, generating new ideas and insights in response to surprising facts, and is normally sparked by a proleptic conception, and anticipatory glimpse, a tenuous and subtle outreach of the understanding with a forward thrust and cognition of something quite new. McGrath. So that might be Alistair McGrath in his book on reality. The abductive process is a common feature of the process of natural science. Archimedes steps into his bath, an apple falls on Newton's head, and an abductive intuitive seed is sown in the mind. The abductive process of making sense of the person of Jesus is clearly visible in the Gospels. They were all amazed. They kept on asking one another, what is this? A new teaching with authority. When his family heard it, they went to restrain him, for people were saying he's gone out of his mind. And on and on. He quotes all of these verses where people are abductively trying to make sense of who Jesus is, right? Love it. Really, really good chapter already. One such abductive intuition gave birth to Christianity. He asked them, who do you say that I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Abductive intuition paves the way for retroductive reasoning, which takes the form of explanatory conceptualizing, theorizing, hypothesizing, and modeling. This is essentially a creative process that requires the proactive engagement of the mind as it strives to identify basic ontological relations and ideas. From Torrance. Once we have reached the basic relations or ideas, we connect them by theorems, which enable us to deduce other ideas and relations in an attempt to produce a theoretical and logically coherent structure through which we may seek to bring to light the inherent and coherent structure of nature. Crucially, although the retroductive construction of explanatory models and theorems is a fallible human activity, it does not necessarily lead to forms of constructivism which reduce all such models to the status of fictions or conventions. And that is because we split metaphysics and epistemology, right? So, while epistemology is relativistic, ontology or metaphysics are not. And it's that split that allows us to arrive at these conclusions. He continues, Torrance insists the veracity of any given construction is dependent upon our placing the concepts that creatively arise in our minds under the compulsion of the objective structures of nature, so that while basic scientific ideas and relations are intuitively reached, they are objectively determined and controlled. Unlike deductive and inductive reasoning, retroductive reasoning from inference is to the best explanation generates the concept of ontological stratification, according to which the universe comprises a sequence of rising levels, each higher one controlling the boundaries of one below it and embodying thereby the joint meaning of the particulars situated on the lower level. The meaning of the whole is discerned in the higher strata of reality, and it is not reducible to the laws by which the ultimate particulars of the universe are controlled. This means that as we move up the hierarchy of levels of reality, from the most tangible to the most intangible, we penetrate to things that are increasingly real and full of meaning, even though, in a sense, they're decreasingly apprehended, right? Because they're more and more difficult for us to grasp. Contra Richard Rorty, it is not self-deceptive to think we possess a deep hidden metaphysically significant nature which makes us irreducibly different from inkwells or atoms. Guys, this chapter is fire. Hot fire. Let's finish this section, and then I'll get some more tea. Oh, Polanyi. I was wondering if we'd see Polanyi because I was like, this sounds exactly like Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge when he talks about tacit knowledge, right? Torrance quotes Polanyi in support of his claim that ontological stratification has fundamental theological significance. Such, I believe, is the true transition from science to the humanities and also from our knowing the laws of nature to our knowing the person of God. Torrance invites us to read Christian doctrines as retroductive explanatory models of God's interaction with humankind. Bing, bing, bing. Which means they are potentially fallible and up for grabs as we theologically consider them going forward. Following his lead, we can view the kerygma, proclamation preaching of the first Christians as marking the first stages of retroductive process that led to the production of the ecumenical creeds that constitute the paradigmatic explanatory framework through which Trinitarian Christians seek to iteratively explore and test their faith. Under the impact of Christ's death and resurrection, Peter's original leap of abductive imagination crystallized into a set of interlinked retroductive hypotheses regarding the person of Jesus. He is the reflection of God's glory, the exact imprint of God's very being. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The Word became flesh, and he lived among us. God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. The theologians of the early church, in the context of the encounter with Hellenistic philosophy, subjected the Christian hypothesis to ongoing iterative modification, understood as the successful and incremental revision of how we see or understand something in the light of insights disclosed through the process of the engagement itself, and thereby generated the basic creedal statements of faith centered on the doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation. According to Charles Cochrane, such theological iteration and accompanying spiritual praxis enabled Christianity to assert its intellectual and moral superiority over a moribund Hellenistic culture. Whether this historical judgment is true and whether it supports claims to the veracity of Christianity remain open questions. Our concern here is not directly with the truth of Christianity, but with the nature, status, and warrant of its epistemic procedures. Thank you. Torrance's argument is that now, with exceptions imposed by the unique nature of the primary object of Christian knowledge, Christian theologians from the start tended to follow the abductive, retroductive, iterative process defined by critical realists. And as such, and prior to the explicit identification and articulation of their tacit, critically realistic epistemic assumptions, already know more epistemically than they could actually tell. Guys, this is fantastic. Really, really good section here. All right, I reached the end of the section. Time for some tea. Let me know, guys. I haven't done any specific videos trying to treat other critical realist ideas and stuff like that. We will do those things going forward, but let me know like what you need, what's not making sense. I recognize there's a lot of, I don't know, pre-work that needs to be done. There's a lot of tacit knowledge that you may not have that might make it difficult to understand these ideas, right? I completely recognize that. But you got to start somewhere. And so that's where I'm just like throwing it out there, and I'll try to explain as I go, right? But the whole point of what we're saying here in terms of abductive inference is, let's go here. The whole point, what we're saying here is the way we get knowledge is through an abductive, retroductive, iterative process, okay? It is not through a deductive top-down argumentation. So Christian epistemology in the West is largely deductive in nature. We say, the Bible says, therefore, this is true. I am not objecting to the Bible. I'm objecting to the structure. I do not think that structure is how we actually come to knowledge. It is a false edifice that we have built to try and explain things. But what we're doing is we're making that edifice up after the fact. It's not actually how we came to a knowledge of the truth. You see what I mean? We're building the deductive structure afterwards. All right. What's that book I read a while back? The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. He talks about essentially a post hoc rationalization. That's what we've done when we say the Bible, therefore this is true. It's a post hoc rationalization. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's not actually how we came to a knowledge of the truth. How do we actually come to a knowledge of the truth? It's through abduction and retroduction. What are those things? We are trying to make sense of our world. We're trying to make sense of Christ. And so we posit a theory of who Christ might be, and then we ask, does it fit the data? Okay, what are the data? Those are Bible verses, those are our personal experiences, etc. And so we ask, does it fit the data? And the explanation of Jesus that best fits the data is that he is the God-man. He's 100% God, he's 100% man, okay? That's the best explanation that fits the data, the best one that we found, okay? But we must recognize that it's a pattern that we have come to based upon clues or various blocks of evidence that we have observed up until now. We might get additional clues or additional blocks of evidences, and we might have to adjust our pattern, all right? But for now, we believe it's the best explanation. To me, this is how human beings actually come to knowledge. This is how we learn things. This is how we know things. The Cartesian, I think, therefore I am structure is a post hoc edifice that we've created after the fact, and it's not real. It's not how we come to know things. So what I'm seeking to do here is just say, how do we actually come to know things? What's the situation in which God has placed us in the world? Okay, granting that, how does that affect Christianity, theology, doctrine, hermeneutics, Bible, etc., right? So we're just trying to be honest about how we come to know and what we can know. All right, let's go back to the book. The possibility and actuality of knowledge of God. Torrance's theological science opens with some preliminary observations about the actuality and possibility of knowledge in general, and of knowledge of God in particular. At the general level, Torrance understands knowledge as a relationship between the knower and the object of knowledge. If either is absent, then there can be no actual knowledge relationship, and hence no actual knowledge. In all branches of knowledge, we proceed from our actual knowledge relationships and seek to move forward by clarifying and testing what we already know, and by seeking to deepen and enlarge its content. It follows that it is part of our situation that we are inevitably and inseparably inside the knowledge relation from the start to the end, and so cannot step outside ourselves to an indifferent standpoint from which to view and adjust the relations of thought and being. What does this mean? This means epistemic relativism, okay? It's required. This is what the postmodern movement gets right. The problem is they apply their relativism to metaphysics or ontology as well. That's what they get wrong. But epistemic relativism is correct. It has to be correct because I am a finite creature, all right? It is only from within the context of an established knowledge relationship that we can ask how the object of knowledge can be known. Genuine critical questions as to the possibility of knowledge cannot be raised in abstracto, but only in concreto, not a priori, but only a posteriori. Louder for the people in the back. This is why I am bearish on a priori and deductive argumentation. I'm not saying it doesn't work at all. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm not particularly fond. Turning to the particular question of knowledge of God, Torrance argues that Christian theology arises out of the actual knowledge of God given in and with concrete happening in time and space. It is knowledge of the God who actively meets us and gives himself to be known in Jesus Christ, in Israel, in history, on earth. Operating from within the concrete a posteriori actuality of this knowledge relationship, Christian theologians affirm that knowledge of the Trinitarian God is possible because God elects to be known in this way. In Jesus Christ, God has condescended to reveal himself to us within our creaturely existence and contingency, and he has assumed our humanity to meet us as man to man and make himself known to us within the conditions and limitations of our earthly life, within our visible, tangible, temporal flesh. In Jesus Christ, God has come to reconcile man to himself so that man may be delivered from his self-enclosure and be restored to true objectivity in God and true subjectivity in himself. Objectivity ontologically, subjectivity epistemologically. In Jesus Christ, God has condescended not only to objectify himself for man and to bestow his truth upon him, but also to provide from the side of man and from within man full, adequate, and perfect reception of that truth. It is, of course, possible that the knowledge relationship claimed by Christians is false. Exactly. We could be wrong, since the object of knowledge, the Trinitarian God who elects to enter into An interpersonal relationship with human beings may not actually exist. However, those who doubt the veracity of Christian truth claims cannot legitimately demand a perspective outside of this knowledge relationship, whether putative or real, from which to judge them. Any such demand for a secure foundation of knowledge, including theological knowledge, outside of or prior to an actual knowledge relationship, ignores the reality of epistemic relativism and bypasses the fact that knowledge necessarily proceeds from that which is already known or is to believe to be known. Really, really good. And then I also, sorry, I got to go back a page because I just want to, I'm underlining where it says claim by Christians is possible that the knowledge relationship claimed by Christians is false. This does not make Christianity immune from rational critique, but it does disallow critiques based upon Christian theology's perceived lack of foundational base external to the actuality or the established, whether putative or real, knowledge relationship with God. Or to put matters another way, Trinitarian theology is not dependent for its epistemic warrant upon the veracity and cogency of prior philosophical arguments for the existence of God in classical theism. Amen. Instead, the dispute between those who wish to affirm Christianity and those who wish to reject it must focus on the relative explanatory power of competing, concrete, a posteriori, retroductive explanatory models, rather than on the search for external, abstract, a priori foundations on which to construct such models. Too good, guys. Too good. More tea. Because knowledge is relational, and the nature and possibility of knowledge is co-determined by the nature of the knower and the nature of the object of knowledge. As previously noted, Torrance draws upon Polanyi in affirming a necessary personal coefficient in all human knowledge relationships. The personal factor inevitably enters into scientific knowledge for the very fact of our knowing, as persons enters into what we know. The fact that we understand the impersonal nature order as persons means that the knowledge relationships established by the natural sciences are never purely objective. This has profound and positive implications, above all with respect to ecological challenges arising from previous attempts to harness the powers of nature in impersonal, value-free, instrumental ways. When we enter into knowledge relationships with other persons, the personal coefficient of knowledge works both ways, so that authentic interpersonal relationships are predicated upon the need to engage in our own subjectivity with the subjectivity of other persons. Failure to acknowledge the subjectivity of other people and thereby to treat them merely as impersonal objects has fundamental and almost wholly negative ethical consequences. Christian theology claims that the Trinitarian God, as a personal being in whose image human persons are created, chooses to meet us in his own subjectivity. Hence, to enter into a knowledge relationship with God is to enter into an intersubjective and interpersonal relationship. Whenever we enter into a genuinely interpersonal relationship, whether with another human being or with God, we risk the possibility that it may transform our lives. That is what Christians understand by faith, not an epistemic last resort in the form of a blind leap beyond reason, but the courage to risk the transformation of one's being and identity through engagement with the personhood of God. This stress on intersubjectivity necessarily entails the objectivity of the other person in her personal subjectivity. To engage with other persons without respecting and acknowledging their distinctive objective identity is to subsume them within one's own frame of reference, and thereby ignore their personal subjectivity and reduce an I-thou relationship to an I-it relationship. I preached on I-thou and I-it before. Authentic knowledge relationships are predicated on the primacy of the object of knowledge. The knower must relate to the other persons as they actually are, and as they choose to relate to us, not as she might wish, prefer, imagine, or assume them to be. God is person, and when he objectifies himself for our knowledge, he does not cease to be subject, to be himself. He does not give himself to us as a mere object subjected to our knowing, but as a subject who maintains himself in implacable objectivity over against us, objecting to any attempt on our part to subject him to our knowing. Torrance identifies three basic dimensions of realistic knowledge of God. One, it is rational, insofar as rationality is understood as our ability to relate our thought and our action appropriate to the objective, intelligible realities, and to recognize an assent to what is beyond it. Such rationality must be distinguished from forms of neo-Kantianism, in which the object of knowledge is subsumed and categorized with our own cognitive and conceptual frameworks. Scientific procedure will not allow us to go beyond the boundaries set by the object, for that would presume that by the inherent powers of our own autonomous reason, we can gain mastery over it. Two, it is objective, insofar as, like all genuinely scientific knowledge, it is constituted at the formal level by a conscious relation to an object which we recognize to be distinct from ourselves, but toward which we direct our thought as something intelligible and ascertainable. I think that just means it's real, independent of us, right? Three, it is conceptual, both in its acts of cognition and acts of expression. Right from the start, it involves a structured understanding, informed acts of cognition, while the whole movement of theological thought consists in developing and clarifying the conceptual structure of this knowledge by constant reference to the object and by advancing in the cognitive modes of rationality set up between us and God as he as he communicates himself to us. So the relationality is what has been important the last couple pages, right? And the relationality means that because we're trying to analyze an objective thing, i.e. God, but because of our subjective sense, we only imperfectly grasp God. And we have to try and assess him for who he is. We don't get to just impose whatever we want, but by the same token, we have to recognize our own subjectivity in trying to assess and understand who he is and what he's like, right? That's how I understand it. All right. Theological science and the development of natural science. Torrance now turns to the question of the relationship between theology and the natural sciences. Theology is not concerned with God in abstracto, but only as he has revealed himself to man as creator and redeemer within the creaturely objectivities of the world. Because of this, theology must maintain faithful and responsible relations toward worldly objectives in accordance with their creaturely nature. The theologian must be committed to an objective, realistic, scientific understanding of the created order, since this is the context in which God has placed human beings and elected to enter into relationship with them. In relating and responding to God, humanity cannot avoid simultaneously relating and responding to the divinely created order of things, including both the natural world and other persons. Despite the modern assumption of a fundamental tension between theology and natural science, theology can still claim to have mothered throughout the long centuries the basic beliefs and impulses which have given rise especially to modern epistemological science. Specifically, theology is committed to the ultimate and essential intelligibility of God's creation and its God-given freedom to function contingently apart from any divinely imposed necessity. And the way I often say this is I say God is not arbitrary, right? That's how I think of this. A lot of ways in which we conceive of God working sound or feel like God is arbitrarily imposing his will upon his creation. And he doesn't have to or need to do that, right? Of course, he can do that, but he doesn't have to or need to. This is neither to deny that natural science has its origin in ancient Greece, nor that its progress has at times been improperly hindered by the Christian church. Torrance traces such hindrance back beyond modern disputes with the likes of Galileo and Darwin to the dominance of Augustine's Christian Platonism in the early stages of Western Christendom. By the way, the author, Andrew Wright, is very opposed to Christian Platonism or Neoplatonism. I'm not as bearish on Platonism, partly because I think that Neoplatonism and Platonism contain elements of ontological realism in them, which to me is very important. So although the entire system may not map onto how I believe, they get parts and pieces correct, at least in a way that I find helpful, right? So just want you to know that about the author. Which perpetuated a negative attitude towards the physical world and envisaged salvation as an escape from the created order. That's not true of necessity. Augustinianism effectively reduced the immanent created order to the role of providing sacramental intimations of a greater transcendent realm rather than that of providing the material context in which God elects to dwell with and relate to human beings. This Augustinian Platonic turn from the world threatened the orthodox sense of the essential goodness and intrinsical intelligibility of creation. Again, I think he doesn't read Augustine correctly at this point. Disagreed that this is true of necessity. Despite this, the Christian commitment to the value of lucidity of creation was still nourished by the church in the Middle Ages. As a consequence of Thomas Aquinas, spurred by the rediscovery of Aristotle following Christian contact with Muslim scholars, was able to develop a medieval scholastic theology that recovered a sense of the order and intelligibility of nature. Aristotle's notion that the natural order is impregnated with causal mechanisms allowed Aquinas to read an eternal pattern of order off the face of nature. However, this positive move had two negative effects. First, it helped reduce the personal God of Christianity to Aristotle's impersonal, unmoved mover, thereby opening the door to the sub-Christian deism that was to dominate the philosophical theology of the Enlightenment. And second, the Aristotelian interpretation of nature in light of the final and primary causes left little room for the element of real contingency in nature, upon which modern a posteriori experimental science depends. It was the Protestant reformers, under the influence of both their reading of the Bible and appropriation of late medieval nominalism, who recovered a sense of the contingency of nature and integrated it with the Thomist sense of its inherent order and intelligibility. In doing so, they effectively displayed the Stoic Latin view of God as Deus sive natura, in favor of the essentially biblical view of God, the creator of all things and the active redeemer of his people. They learned directly from William of Ockham, whose nominalism effectively freed particular events in the world from any notion of an eternal pattern of causal necessity, whether derived from Platonic forms or Aristotelian causality, and thereby liberated God from his deistic role as the necessary source and ground of such a closed causal nexus. Only when nature was liberated from medieval rationalism and disenchanted from its secret divinity, and only when it was realized that the order of nature, while intelligible to us theologically as divine creation, precisely because it is a creaturely order, can only be known through observation and interpretation of the creaturely processes themselves, could the more or less static science of the ancient and medieval world give way to the great movement of modern science. Modern empirical science emerged on the back of two basic assumptions: an ultimate orderliness behind the flux of nature and an elementary contingency in creaturely existence. If Augustine's Christian reading of Plato served to occlude the orderliness of nature, and Aquinas' Christian reading of Aristotle served to occlude the contingency of nature, then the Protestant recovery of the Orthodox Christian doctrine of creation, untainted by Platonic and Aristotelian elements, offered a model of God's creation as simultaneously ordered yet contingent. Well, I like the both and here. I don't necessarily agree with the read of, how he got here, but I do like the both and if he wants to attribute that to Protestantism, I'll take the W. Alongside the distinction between God and creation, the Reformers also asserted a distinction between grace and nature. The deistic God of the Enlightenment was envisaged as essentially united with the natural order as its ultimate source and first cause. This, in turn, opened the door to a natural theology in which human beings could reason upwards from nature to God, and thereby, through the exercise of autonomous reason, engineer their own salvation. If the reduction of God to an impersonal first cause necessarily linked to the natural causal chain allowed for the quasi-divinization of nature, it did so at the cost of reducing the divine in nature to the level of mechanistic emanation from an impersonal and deterministic source. And if deism allowed human beings to be attributed a share in the divine nature, it did so at the cost of reducing human beings to the level of Neoplatonic possessors of the divine spark of a potentially capricious deity. The Protestant principle of absolute priority of divine grace, as revealed in the biblical witness to the life of Jesus of Nazareth, envisaged God creating, sustaining, and pouring his grace out onto a world utterly distinct from its creator. This gave creation a higher status as the object of divine love and attention, and human beings a higher status as those created only a little lower than God and crowned with glory and honor, invited into personal relationships with their creator that envisaged by deistic philosophy. The distinction between grace and nature recalled theology to a proper sense of the otherness of God, and hence to the need for a theological objectivity, and directed natural science towards its proper object, and reminded it of the central importance of objectivity in its investigations of the natural order. This disallowed any theological veto over the scientific investigation of nature, since the natural order is a stratum of reality that God created to exist and function freely and independently of the divine will, and vice versa. Disallowed any natural scientific veto over the theological or metaphysical investigations of a transcendent or divine stratum of reality existing above and beyond the natural order of things. Thus, both theological science and natural science share the same aims: to achieve a proper understanding of their respective objects of knowledge and strata of reality by entering into appropriate knowledge relationships with them. Such relationships must be concrete and a posteriori rather than abstract and a priori. The former allows the objective reality of the object to shape the mind of the knower, whereas the latter generates the epistemic fallacy of allowing the mind of the knower to shape the object of knowledge. The only fundamental difference between natural and theological science, albeit a significant one, is that the distinctive nature of their primary objects of knowledge, respectively, the impersonal order of nature and the personal Trinitarian God, make different demands on the knower and hence require the development of different epistemic tools that require progressive refinement in the light of emergence of progressively deeper understandings of the objects as they are designed to illuminate. Ding, 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 ding. And I agree. What he's essentially saying is, how knowledge works doesn't change whether you're talking about God or whether you're talking about gravity, right? The same knowledge structure or system functions in both, but the difference is trying to know about God through scientific means requires a slightly different approach, but otherwise you're doing the same kind of thing, if that makes sense, right? You're doing the same kinds of things. All right, need more tea. I've got several more pages here, guys, so let me know if you guys are liking it thus far. Again, I understand if it's going over your head and you're struggling, but I don't know how to get the ideas out there except for to start, right? So that's kind of where I'm at. And yeah, we'll just start. We'll keep creating stuff like this and trying to think through these things together, and hopefully we'll come to a little bit better understanding as we do so together. I'm going to heat this up because it's cooled down. I like it to be just under burning my mouth temperature. So I'll be right back. Alrighty. Nice and piping hot. Very yummy. Next section, the nature of scientific activity. Torrance insists that any account of either theological or natural science cannot be abstracted from the actual processes of scientific inquiry in specific fields of study. Nevertheless, it is possible to identify the basic contours of a generic scientific attitude applicable to all fields of learning and discovery. This consists of the vigorous application of our basic rationality as we seek to act towards objects in ways appropriate to their natures, the careful and systematic ordering of our thinking on the presumption of the inherent intelligibility of reality and sensitivity and openness to the manifold and stratified order of things. This generic scientific attitude excludes all forms of secular scientism and religious fundamentalism. Love it. And so this is the third leg of critical realism, which is judgmental rationality. That's what this is. The traditional distinction between scientia generalis and scientia specialis retains a certain value. The notion of general science correctly identifies the fact that different spheres of scientific exploration share certain fundamental principles in common: a concern to discern the objective nature of particular objects of knowledge, an awareness of the nature of the knower and the modes of knowing appropriate to a human nature, a commitment to formal scientific procedures, and a recognition of the nature and structure of thinking. However, general science has no independent existence apart from the concrete sciences, and as such cannot be abstracted from them and reified as an autonomous scientia universalis. In particular, general science must not be confused with philosophy. Science is a means of discovering knowledge, while philosophy is a form of thinking that, despite its ability to help clarify our understanding of reality and of the nature of knowledge, cannot add anything positive or substantial to the raft of human knowledge. The fact that there is no necessary fit between the logical structures of philosophical thought and the logical structures of scientific theories is exemplified by the fact that the emergence of a modern nuclear physics requires the abandonment of Euclidean logic. Ultimately, there are only particular sciences which bear the responsibility of modifying general science in ways appropriate to the distinctive nature of their specific objects of knowledge. It follows that each particular science has its own particular aims, methods, and modes of rationality generated a posteriori through concrete interaction with its allocated stratum of reality. Theological science shares with the other sciences a common set of assumptions ordered around the fundamental principle of objectivity, as well as an obligation to adapt these assumptions in the light of the unique nature of its particular object. Christian theological science is concerned with human knowledge of God revealed in Jesus Christ and with the explication of modes of knowing appropriate to the divine nature. It follows that theology must have its particular principles relevant to this unique object or field of knowledge where divine self-disclosure is involved. Theology remains scientific to the extent that its domain-specific procedures conform to the generic canons of general science embraced by all genuinely scientific endeavors. Torrance identifies 5 key markers of the scientific nature of theology. Oh, this should be interesting. 1. Theological science is marked by a devotion to its proper object and a total reverence for objectivity. 2. Theological science is committed to the rigorous, disciplined, methodological organization of knowledge. 3. Theological science entails a search for elemental forms through which to reduce the multiplicity of theoretical knowledge to a basic order in response to the claims of objective reality. The application of the principles of Occam's razor to the construction of retroductive explanatory theories does not allow for the identification of theoretical constructs with ontic structures, though they must be determined by and point towards the ontic order inherent in the object of knowledge. It remains the sine qua non of scientific advance that our theoretical constructs penetrate through the mass of our conceptions and correlations to primary and elemental forms, and thereby attain a profounder and clearer knowledge of nature. I'm going to have to read this again, guys. I'm not understanding point number 3 here. Entails a search for elemental forms through which to reduce the multiplicity. I try to multiply. I don't try to reduce the multiplicity of theological knowledge. I try to multiply options and then assign essentially percentages to each option. And I'm not a big fan of Occam's razor because I like inference to the best explanation, but I think Occam's razor often presumes too much, right? I don't think the simplest explanation is necessarily the most likely. There are other factors involved, but I might be misreading him. The application of the principle of Occam's razor to the construction of retroductive explanatory theories does not allow for the identification of theoretical constructs with ontic structures, though they must be determined by and point towards the ontic order inherent in the object of knowledge. I think I understand that. To me, that's the epistemic relativism. Ontologically, it has a structure. I can't grasp the structure directly, but they point towards. Our theoretical constructs penetrate through the mass of our conceptions and correlations to primary and elemental forms, and thereby. So I think what he's saying, to me, it's understanding epistemic relativism. We can still feel our way out towards the metaphysical reality. That's my understanding there. I think I agree with it. It's worded in a way that makes me pause. Let's go to number 4. Theological science approaches scientific inquiry via a form of questioning in which we allow what we already know or hold to be knowledge to be called in question by the object. Amen. This is not the same as Socratic questioning, which aims to clarify what we already know by sifting out false knowledge and recollecting true knowledge. Torrance holds that Socratic questioning is not scientific because its central point of reference is the mind of the knower, rather than the object under investigation, whereas scientific questioning seeks to be responsive to the object of knowledge so that the scientist is humbled before the object and allows its reality to shape her emergent questions. I agree with that. And finally, number 5. Oh, no, this continues. This point number 4 is long. To achieve their end, scientific questions must be ruthless and unrelenting, probing down to the deepest depths of our knowing in order to uncover and cut away all that hinders us from behaving in terms of the nature of the object, and in order to allow ourselves to be told by the object what we cannot tell ourselves about it, and so genuinely to learn what is beyond what we already know or think we know. Such scientific questioning must not be confused with skepticism and doubt, which insofar as it affirms the knower's prior assumptions regarding the putative nature of an object of knowledge, is actually a form of self-certainty. Rather, scientific questioning places faith in the inherent intelligibility of any given object of knowledge, despite the fact that such intelligibility may currently be beyond the capacity of human beings to grasp. Progress in science is possible because we refuse thoroughgoing skepticism in favor of a primal faith in the basic intelligibility of both creation and creator. That's fine. I often say that I'm skeptical, but to me, it's getting a bit semantic. I agree with the sense that he's describing here. All right. Number 5. Theological science requires a problematic form of thinking in which we interrogate the object of knowledge in order to verify the truth of our claims about it. Different strata of reality require different verification procedures. If I read Torrance correctly here, this means that our judgments about other persons and our assessments of their characters and motivations are not amenable to overly rationalistic thought or experimental testing, but instead demand more holistic and intuitive levels of discernment. To suggest that such discernment is merely subjective is to artificially limit our knowledge of reality to the level of demonstrable certainty provided by the epistemic tools available to us. The fact that our understanding of other persons may appear less tangible than our understanding of chemical reactions measured in a laboratory does not mean that interpersonal understanding is any less truthful or real. We can and do identify the Holocaust to be a great evil and are entirely justified in doing so, even though we may not have access to any strict formal procedures for verifying such a claim beyond that of intuitive moral discernment. With regard to our intuitive discernment of human character, among our best guides are the great novelists, whose insight into human nature can only be properly expressed through the medium of fictional narrative, which enables the author to show that which could not otherwise be said. Since God reveals himself on an intersubjective level, the verification of theological statements is necessarily bounded by forms of spiritual intuition, analogous to our intuitive discernment of other persons. That's pretty cool. He's got room for the imagination here, right? Fictional imagination arriving at truth, essentially. These 5 markers of the scientific nature of theology must be read in light of the distinctive nature of the object of theological knowledge. The personal triune God is revealed both as the sovereign Lord of his creation who calls into question all human self-assertion, and as the divine servant who graciously under labors for creation and washes the feet of his creatures. Torrance distinguishes between the ontological truth of being and the epistemic truth of knowing. Truth consists in the conformity of things in their inherent intelligibility to the eternal word of God, so that the ultimate truth of creation is evident only in light of its creator. The primary form of theological truth is not abstract ideas, concepts, and statements, but interpersonal knowledge relationships. God's truth is that which we can meet and know in our concrete existence through personal encounter and rational cognition. The ontological truth of God is final and ultimate. True statements about God are necessarily contingent and are possible only because God, as ultimate truth, meets us in Jesus Christ within our historical contingency. Hello, Jimbo. What is up? How you doing? Thanks for swinging by. I like this necessarily contingent. In him, God turns in grace towards us and makes himself open to us, summoning us to be open towards him and to keep faith and truth with him in Jesus, so that we may be true as God is true and learn to do the truth as he does the truth. The primary interpersonal and intersubjective truth of our knowledge relation with God can be articulated in secondary theological propositions. There is a circular relationship between theological propositions and theological judgments. Theological propositions function to declare theological judgments, while theological judgments assess theological propositions. The interconnection between propositions and judgments presupposes a communal knowledge relationship. Theological propositions and judgments are not individual expressions of or logical deductions from generic human experience and thought. Rather, they are communal responses. This reminds me of my structure I always draw, so I'm going to draw it right here. So if I get it right, I always draw this structure here. And if I get it right, propositions go here, and judgments go here. Rather, they are communal responses to a word that is heard, a truth that is communicated, or an act that is done to us. A propositional question or rational communication that is directed to us from God himself in his Son, the Word made flesh, requiring recognition, response, decision for the articulation on our part. Crucially, theological statements arise out of real dialogue initiated by God and not out of some irrational monologue we carry within ourselves. Theological propositions are existent statements that proffer truth claims about the nature of reality. There can be no proof of the truth of such statements independent of the knowledge relationships in which they originate. It follows that we can only convince others of their truth if we can get them to see or hear the reality they refer to as we see or hear it, and share our intuition of the objects given. Torrance uses intuition here to refer to our apprehension of reality and its objectivity and unity as a whole. I really, really like this one. As such, it refers not to the psychology of the knowing subject, but to the establishment of a knowledge relationship through which the subject comes to intuit an object in a way appropriate to its nature. Existence statements are never complete because their meaning does not lie in them, but in the reality they seek to denote. In the act of intuition, the mind is always open to a reality not fully comprehended and irreducible to abstract concepts. Existence statements and coherent statements are mutually dependent, so that a set of incoherent and mutually exclusive existence statements excludes the possibility of affirming the truth of the entire set. Nevertheless, coherent statements cannot provide an additional source of knowledge to supplement the existence statements generated by the concrete knowledge relationships. In this respect, existence statements are basic and primary. Theological existence statements are forced upon the theologian by the pressure of the objective reality of God. They emerge a posteriori out of divinely instigated knowledge relationships between God and humanity, and have a reference to the historical Jesus Christ as the objective reality beyond them. But in and through Jesus Christ, they refer to God himself as the ultimate objectivity. The internal coherence of existence statements is one, albeit highly significant, indicator of their truth or falsehood. That's really important. So in epistemology, you have coherence theories of truth. You have other theories of truth. And what he's saying is coherence theories, although they may not tell us truth, they can give us an indicator, right here, the internal coherence of existence statements, right? And so I often think of coherence theories as helpful for justification, not necessarily for truth. I.e., you can have greater confidence that something is true if it coheres, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And then I also liked their meaning does not lie in them. All right, more tea. Sorry, it's really good tea. All right. The logic of theology. Like all scientific statements, theological propositions possess their own specific logic by virtue of the distinctive nature of their object of knowledge. All scientific enterprises face the problem that being always breaks through the limits of our statements and outruns their logical forms. Theology faces the added difficulty that because God, by his very nature, cannot be conceived of in the same way that we conceive of objects in the created order, the way in which statements refer to God is rather different from the way in which they refer to anything else. To speak of the logic of God is not to attempt to enter into the mind of God, but to understand God as he elects to reveal himself to us. Thus, the logic of God is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, the incarnation of the external Logos of God, the eternal Logos of God, excuse me. The actuality of the incarnation carries with it its own particular logic. The logic of grace, in which God gives himself to us as the object of our knowledge without ceasing to be the divine subject, so that we know God only as God knows us. The logic of the incarnation, in which the hypostatic union between God and humanity in Christ provides the normative pattern of all theological statements. The logic of love, by which the divine and human natures of Christ are united in one person, establishes love as the proper mode of interpersonal relations and the ontological ground of all reality, both created and uncreated. The logic of history, grounded in the fact that since God engages ontologically with creation in the specific history of Jesus Christ, he is known only in concrete communal historical contexts, and not in abstract individual mystical experiences that transcend particular spatio-temporal coordinates. Because theological propositions are dependent upon and derived from historical events, they are a product of the church by virtue of her tradition-specific testimonial relationship with the historical Jesus. If the church, as the body of Christ, constitutes the sphere where actual knowledge of truth is to be found, within that sphere, the understanding of the truth is articulated in a body of truths that drive from and ultimately cohere in the person of Christ, who is himself the one truth of God. Put in more prosaic terms, if the church had not acted as the custodian of distinctively Christian retroductive explanation of ultimate reality, there would be no knowledge of the Trinitarian God. That's quite the claim. I'm not sure I agree with that. God could have used other methods, but this is the method he seemed to have chose. To speak of the logic of man is to seek to unpack the logic of human attempts to formulate accounts of the Trinitarian God. In seeking to enter into a loving relationship with us, God does not override our humanity through any deterministic predestination, but instead gives us the freedom to be ourselves, to overcome our self-imposed alienation from self, others, and nature, and to enter freely into a proper relationship with our Creator. This includes the freedom to articulate theological propositions that employ human forms of thought and speech. The task of the theologian is to strive to bring human forms of speech into conformity with the realities they intend to refer to. Here, the theologian faces a dual temptation: to confuse human expression with divine reality, or to allow human expression to subsume and colonize divine reality. Thus, to speak of divine love is not to project human love onto God, but to identify the true nature of divine love as revealed in the person, teaching, and actions of Jesus Christ, and to use this divine love as the measure with which they judge human relationships. To me, I see some semiotics here. The failure to allow the ontological reality of God to override epistemically relative human theological constructs leads Roman Catholicism to forms of ecclesiastical idealism and the advocacy of papal infallibility, and the Protestant churches to forms of anthropological idealism and the advocacy of biblical infallibility. I disagree with his assessment here, but I see his point, right? That's not where the issues are, but I understand what he's doing. I do think Western Roman Catholic and Protestant churches make the same mistake, but I don't think it's the papal infallibility, biblical infallibility mistake they're making. Insofar as theological propositions are unavoidably fallible human constructs, they always fall short of the realities they seek to describe. Agree with that. Insofar as theological propositions are able to establish a partial ontological purchase, they offer truthful, though necessarily provisional and incomplete accounts of divine reality. Really important phrase there. The theological pursuit of deeper truth entails the logic of question and answer through which divine reality is progressively revealed as our abductively grounded retroductive explanations are iteratively refined in the ongoing attempt to establish for our theological statements a stronger purchase upon reality and a greater internal coherence. Good. That's a good little section right there. All right, let's see the next page. It looks like the way it ended that we're going to a new section. Oh, it's the last page. Cool. Let's finish this off, guys. Next chapter, Radical Orthodoxy Beyond Secular Reason. Radical Orthodoxy is its own movement. I wonder if he's going to be referring to the Milbanks. John and Allison Milbank and Adrian Pabst. It follows that theological statements must be open to critical re-examination and reconstruction, and that they must never be used instrumentally to enforce a premature epistemic closure. This is really, really important. Must never be used. Premature epistemic closure. This is really important. The responsibility of the theologian to strive to bring our statements into conformity with reality in order to ensure they retain their function as disclosure models. This requires the repeated testing of existent statements in the light of the established knowledge relationship between God and the Church, a relationship rooted in the ontological actuality of the Incarnation, attested in Scripture, transmitted in tradition, proclaimed in preaching, and sustained in worship and prayer. It also requires the repeated analysis of coherent statements to ensure the coherence of the inner logic of existent statements, while constantly guarding against the idealistic trap of allowing coherent statements to override
your life is not
statements.
in your hands. Your life is in the hands of God.
Come on.
Clemson Lady 0322 just
wild.
resubbed for 69 months.
That is wild. Clemson Lady, how are you? Clemson, good to see you. How are you? Welcome. Holy smokes. 69 months. That is wild. That is absolutely insanity. Right? I mean, I'm trying to math out how many is that? That's what, nearly 6 years? Is that like 6 years? Oh my goodness. Crazy. Been a long time, no doubt. It's been a very long time. I'm doing great. How are you? How's life? I mean, you're getting used to that parent life, right? How's the family? How's all that going? Hope things are well. Man, 69 months. That's crazy. Absolutely wild. Well, it's good to see you. Thanks for swinging by. I'm doing fantastic. Very, very cool. We're almost done with this chapter. Got kiddo number 2 on the way. Wow, holy smokes. Little one is 2.5. We are living it up. That's fantastic. Are you enjoying parent life? It's very different, isn't it? I learned a lot and grew a lot. That's awesome. Wow, so cool. And number 2 on the way. Oh, man. It's been a blessing. That's so cool. Awesome. I'm really happy to hear that. Thanks for sharing. Really, really cool. Yeah, I'm reading a book here on critical realism and Christianity and the intersection between the two. All right, gonna finish up here. This requires the repeated testing of existent statements in light of the established knowledge relationship between God and the Church, a relationship rooted in the ontological actuality of the Incarnation, attested in Scripture, transmitted in tradition, proclaimed in preaching, and sustained in worship and prayer. It also requires the repeated analysis of coherent statements to ensure the coherence of the inner logic of existent statements, while constantly guarding against the idealist trap of allowing coherent statements to override existent statements. Torrance identifies similarities and differences between theological science and other scientific endeavors. He views theology as a positive, independent science operating on its own ground and develops its own distinctive modes of inquiry. It differs from other sciences only because of the uniqueness of its primary object of investigation. Theological science is possible only because God elects to reveal himself in humanity, though in responding to this revelation it remains a fallible human endeavor. As such, it faces the same boundaries as all other scientific activities, seeking to rigorously test its truth claims in light of the reality it seeks to comprehend more fully and understand more deeply. At the same time, because theology cannot bypass the claims of God on humanity and the responses of humanity to God, and since this dialectic of claim and response concerns ultimate reality and the ultimate good of humanity, it is distinct from other sciences. Because the proper object of theological investigation is God, theology cannot trespass into the realm of other scientific endeavors with the particular objects of knowledge, and must instead respect them as independent branches of knowledge. As such, it can only speak about other independent sciences if they themselves transgress their appointed spheres and trespass into the domain of theology. Thus, for example, given the stratified nature of the created order, reductive attempts to dismiss Christian truth claims on the basis of genetic determinism or biological behaviorism constitute an unwarranted and illegitimate privileging of one particular domain of scientific investigation over another. I disagree with this. You can offer any sort of, explanatory model derived from whatever to explain the said data. But, yes, it shouldn't be privileged. We just need to recognize where it's coming from and whether or not it offers, better explanation or not. So, if the truth claims of Christian theology are to be dismissed, they must be dismissed as theological claims, not as pseudoscientific claims transgressing the domain of natural sciences. I understand what they're objecting to here, but I just disagree. So I'll just write disagreed in the margin here. But I agree with the spirit of what he's trying to do. He's saying you can't dismiss theology offhand, which I agree with that. But I think the way we analyze scientific inquiry and theological inquiry is actually a lot closer than he's indicating. All right, guys, that's the end of chapter 11. So, end of chapter 11. I hope you guys found that interesting. Give me feedback on what you want. There's no content like this, very little on critical realism and Christianity. And so, I hope to provide more and more content like this on this channel, but I recognize it's niche stuff. So anyway, you got to do what you feel called to do. And I feel called to dig into this and try to understand a little bit more on the epistemic side of things. So, but I think I'm going to wrap up here. We've been going a little over an hour on this individual stream. And then if you combine this with the stream we did beforehand, we're actually over 2 hours. So, But Clemson, so good to see you again. Thanks for swinging by. And I hope you guys find this information helpful. Chapter 12 is entitled Radical Orthodoxy. And it looks like he's getting into the Milbanks and all that other type of stuff. I'd be interested in digging into this. I've got some works from the Milbanks. So it might be a nice little introduction to radical orthodoxy as a movement. I might check that out next time. I don't know when I will have next time. We don't have a consistent streaming schedule yet, but maybe we'll get one in the future. So anyway, appreciate you guys so much. Thanks for hanging out and swinging by. And appreciate your guys' support of Pastor Tanner Ministries. I know we're trying to do something a little different here. But let me know how I can support what's needed and what would be helpful to you. All right. Well, appreciate you all very much. You guys have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you all again real soon. Take care. God bless.